The mop hit the concrete floor with a wet slap that echoed through the cavernous hangar at Miramar Naval Air Station. Sarah Chun pushed a strand of black hair from her face, leaving a streak of cleaning solution across her cheek. The F/A-18 Super. Hornets towered above her like sleeping giants, their sleek bodies gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. She'd been scrubbing these floors for 8 months now, invisible to everyone who mattered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October morning started like any other at Miramar. Sarah arrived at 0500 hours, her civilian clothes marking her as an outsider among the sea of flight suits and maintenance uniforms. She clocked in at the janitorial station, grabbed her cart, and wheeled it toward Hangar 7. The massive space housed 6 FA-18F Super Hornets from VFA-31, the Tomcatter Squadron. These weren't just any jets, they were the crown jewels of naval aviation, and Sarah treated them with the reverence they deserved. She started her routine in the far corner, methodically working her way across the oil-stained concrete. The hangar was quiet except for the distant hum of machinery and the occasional radio chatter from the control tower. Most of the pilots wouldn't arrive until 0700, giving Sarah nearly 2 hours of solitude with the aircraft she both admired and avoided looking at too closely. As she mopped beneath the wing of Aircraft 107, her movement caused something to slip from her jacket pocket. The small, triangular patch hit the wet floor with barely a sound, but in the echoing hangar, it might as well have been a gunshot. Sarah quickly glanced around, still alone, and bent to retrieve it. The patch was worn and faded, its edges frayed from years of wear. The distinctive Top Gun logo was barely visible, the red and gold colors dulled by time and countless washings. Sarah's fingers trembled as she held it, memories flooding back like a dam bursting. She'd earned this patch 7 years ago, graduating second in her class from the Navy Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program. She'd worn it proudly on her flight suit until the day everything changed. "Ma'am, you dropped something." Sarah's heart stopped. She spun around to find Commander Jake Morrison standing 10 feet away, his flight suit crisp and pressed, silver wings gleaming on his chest. He was tall, probably 6'2", with the kind of confident posture that came from years of flying $1-million aircraft. His sandy brown hair was regulation short, and his blue eyes held the sharp intelligence of a seasoned pilot. Sarah quickly shoved the patch into her pocket, but it was too late. Morrison had seen it. His eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. "Sorry, sir," Sarah mumbled, returning to her mop. "Just some trash." But Morrison didn't move. He stood there studying her, his head tilted slightly. Sarah could feel his gaze like a weight on her shoulders as she continued cleaning, hoping he would just walk away and forget what he'd seen. "That wasn't trash," Morrison said quietly. "That was a Top Gun patch." Sarah's hands tightened on the mop handle. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, watching the dirty water swirl around the concrete. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir." Morrison took a step closer. "I've been flying for 15 years. I know a Top Gun patch when I see one." That particular one looked well worn, like it belonged to someone who earned it. The hangar suddenly felt smaller. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat over the ambient noise. She risked a glance at Morrison and saw something unexpected in his expression, not accusation or mockery, but genuine interest. "Look," Morrison continued, his voice softer now, "I'm not trying to cause trouble, but I'm curious. You've been cleaning this hangar for months, and I've watched you work around these jets like you know them. Most janitors barely look at the aircraft, but you're different." Sarah wanted to run. She wanted to grab her cart and disappear into the maze of corridors that connected the hangars. Instead, she found herself frozen, caught between the past she'd tried to bury and the present she'd been forced to accept. Morrison pulled out his phone and scrolled through something. Sarah Chun, right? That's what your name tag says. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Sarah Chun, Morrison repeated thoughtfully. You know, that name sounds familiar. There was a pilot, Navy pilot ... a few years back. Made headlines for some reason. His eyes widened slightly. Wait, you're not. Are you Lieutenant Sarah Chun? The one who... I'm just a janitor, Sarah cut him off, her voice barely above a whisper. But the words felt like ash in her mouth. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Sarah could see the wheels turning in his head, connecting dots she'd hoped would never be connected. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, he said slowly. Call sign Phoenix. Graduated TOPGU in 2017. Deployed twice to the Persian Gulf. Distinguished Flying Cross recipient. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. The pilot who saved Flight 47. Sarah's legs felt weak. Flight 47. 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days ago. She could still see the fireball in her mind. Still feel the G-forces as she drove her Hornet into an impossible approach. Still hear the screams over the radio as she pulled the crippled commercial airliner's survivors from the wreckage in the middle of the Pacific. That was a long time ago, Sarah said, her voice cracking. Morrison shook his head in amazement. A long time ago? Sarah, you saved 247 lives that day. The whole aviation community was talking about it. That approach you made, landing a damaged FA-18 on a sinking cargo ship to coordinate the rescue. It was impossible, and you made it look routine. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to push down the emotions that were threatening to surface. Things change, Commander. People change. What happened? Morrison asked gently. I mean, after the rescue, you just disappeared from the aviation world. There were rumors, but nobody knew for sure. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah looked up at the Super Hornet towering above them, its weapons pylons empty, but somehow still menacing. She thought about the medical boards, the endless evaluations, the quiet conversations about operational stress and mission-related anxiety. She thought about the day they told her she'd never fly again, not for the Navy, not for anyone. Medical discharge, she said finally. PTSD. They said I was no longer fit for flight status. Morrison's expression softened. I'm sorry. That must have been devastating. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. Devastating doesn't cover it. Flying was everything to me, Commander. It was who I was. When they took that away... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. So you became a janitor? I became invisible, Sarah corrected. It seemed easier that way. I could still be around aircraft without anyone asking questions. I could still hear the engine, still smell the jet fuel. It was the closest I could get to the life I used to have. Morrison was quiet for a moment, absorbing this revelation. Sarah could see him struggling with something, weighing his words carefully. Can I ask you something? He said finally. Sarah nodded reluctantly. Do you still love it? Flying, I mean. The question hit her like a physical blow. Sarah found herself staring up at the Hornet again, taking in its sleek lines and predatory grace. She thought about the feeling of pulling G's in a vertical climb, the rush of launching off a carrier deck, the indescribable sensation of being alone in the sky with nothing but skill and instinct between life and death. Every day, she whispered. Morrison nodded as if he'd expected that answer. Then why are you hiding? I'm not hiding, Sarah protested. I'm being realistic. The Navy made their decision. I'm grounded permanently. There's no coming back from that. Maybe not with the Navy, Morrison said carefully. But there are other ways to fly. Sarah shook her head. You don't understand. The medical discharge wasn't just from the Navy. It's on my permanent record. No airline would touch me. No private company would hire me. I'm done, Commander. I've accepted that. Morrison studied her face, and Sarah could see the pilot in him. Analyzing the situation, looking for solutions where others saw only problems. "You know," he said slowly, "I've been flying for 15 years, and I've never met a pilot who could do what you did that day over the Pacific. That kind of skill. That kind of instinct, ... It doesn't just disappear because of a medical board's decision." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she got whenever someone brought up her flying days. "Skill doesn't matter if you can't get in the cockpit." "Depends on the cockpit," Morrison replied cryptically, before Sarah could ask what he meant. The hangar's main doors rolled open with a metallic screech. A maintenance crew rolled in, followed by 2 more pilots in flight suits. The quiet intimacy of the moment was shattered, and Sarah immediately grabbed her mop, returning to her cleaning with renewed intensity. Morrison glanced at the approaching personnel, then back at Sarah. "This conversation isn't over," he said. Quietly. Double quotes, "Yes, it is," Sarah replied without looking up. "Please just forget what you saw, Commander. It's better for everyone." But as Morrison walked away to join his fellow pilots, Sarah could feel his eyes on her. She could sense that something had shifted, that the careful balance she'd maintained for 8 months was about to be upended. As she continued mopping, Sarah could hear the pilots talking in low voices near the aircraft. Occasionally, one of them would glance in her direction, and she knew Morrison was sharing what he'd learned. The secret she'd guarded so carefully was spreading through the squadron like ripples in a pond. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Chun felt exposed. And despite her fear, despite her carefully constructed walls of invisibility, a small part of her was almost relieved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The coffee in the squadron ready room had gone cold an hour ago, but Lieutenant Commander Ryan "Hawk" Patterson kept nursing it anyway. Across the room, Morrison was briefing the morning's flight schedule, but Hawk's attention kept drifting to the maintenance bay visible through the windows. He could see the cleaning lady Sarah, Morrison had said her name was, methodically working her way around the aircraft. "You're staring again," whispered Lieutenant Maria Viper Rodriguez, sliding into the seat next to him. At 28, she was the youngest pilot in VFA 31 and had something to prove every single day. Her dark eyes followed Hawk's gaze to the hangar floor below. "Morrison wasn't kidding, was he?" Hawk murmured. "About who she is?" Viper shook her head. "I looked it up on my tablet during the brief. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, call sign Phoenix. The rescue over the Pacific wasn't the only thing she was famous for. She had the highest gunnery scores in her class at TOPGUN. Flew combat missions over Syria in 2018 and 2019. 2 air-to-air kills confirmed." 2 kills? Hawk raised an eyebrow. "That puts her in pretty exclusive company." "Gets better," Viper continued, scrolling through her tablet. "She was being fast-tracked for squadron command. Word was she was going to be the youngest female commanding officer in the strike fighter community." Hawk watched as Sarah carefully maneuvered her cart around the landing gear of aircraft 104. Even from this distance, he could see the precision in her movements, the way she avoided the sensitive equipment without needing to look. Most civilians would have bumped into something by now. "So what happened?" he asked. Morrison said medical discharge, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Viper's expression grew serious. "That's where it gets complicated. The official record just says medical retirement for service-related conditions, but I found some news articles from around that time. Apparently, the rescue mission took longer than anyone reported. She was in the air for almost 14 hours straight, coordinating between multiple agencies, making impossible approaches to unstable platforms. By the time it was over, she'd pushed her aircraft and herself far beyond normal operational limits. 14 hours in a Hornet? Hawk's eyes widened. That's physically brutal. The fatigue alone. But that wasn't what broke her, Viper said quietly. According to one article, she made 17 rescue runs to different crash sites. 17. Each time she had to watch people die that she couldn't save. The psychological evaluation must have been devastating. Morrison's voice cut through their whispered conversation. Gentlemen, ladies, if we're done with the side discussions, we have a flight schedule to review. Hawk straightened in his chair, but his mind was still processing what Viper had told him. 17 rescue runs. He tried to imagine the mental toll of witnessing that much tragedy, of being responsible for coordinating such a massive operation while flying a single-seat fighter jet for 14 straight hours. After the briefing concluded, Hawk found himself walking toward the hangar instead of the flight line. He told himself he needed to check on some maintenance issues with his aircraft, but truthfully, he was curious about Sarah Chun. He'd never met a pilot who'd been through what she had experienced. He found her in Bay 3, cleaning around the nose. Gear of Aircraft 109. She looked up as he approached, and Hawk could see the wariness in her eyes. Word had clearly spread through the squadron about Morrison's discovery. Lieutenant Commander Patterson, Sarah said formally, recognizing his rank insignia. Is there something wrong with the aircraft? Please call me Hawk, he said, trying to put her at ease. And no, nothing's wrong. I was just curious to meet you properly. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly. There's nothing to meet, sir. I'm just here to clean the hangar. Hawk studied her face, noting the way she held herself. Despite the civilian clothes and the mop in her hands, there was still something unmistakably military in her bearing. The straight shoulders, the direct eye contact, the way she positioned herself with a clear line of retreat, all habits that died hard. You know, Hawk said conversationally, I was stationed at Norfolk when Flight 47 went down. We were on alert, ready to launch a search and rescue if needed. But by the time we got the order, it was already over. One pilot had coordinated the entire operation single-handedly. That was a team effort, Sarah said quietly. The Coast Guard, Navy rescue swimmers, merchant vessels in the area. But you were the quarterback, Hawk interrupted gently. You were the one making the calls, directing the chaos. I read the after-action reports. Without your coordination, hundreds more people would have died. Sarah's knuckles were white where she gripped the mop handle. Those reports are classified. I have the clearance, Hawk replied, and curiosity. It's not often you meet someone who's redefined what a single pilot can accomplish. For a moment, Sarah's carefully constructed facade slipped, and Hawk caught a glimpse of the pain underneath. It was gone almost instantly, replaced by that practiced neutrality. That pilot doesn't exist anymore, Sarah said. She was retired. For medical reasons, retired maybe, but she's still in there. Hawk gestured toward her chest. I can see it in the way you move around these aircraft. You know them. You respect them. Most civilians are intimidated by fighter jets, but you clean around them like you've lived with them your whole life. I have lived with them, Sarah admitted. Just not the way I used to. Before Hawk could respond, another voice interrupted from across the hangar. Phoenix. Both Hawk and Sarah turned to see a grizzled Master Chief Petty Officer striding toward them. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Wrench Thompson was a legend in naval aviation maintenance, with 32 years of service and hands that could diagnose engine problems by touch alone. His weathered face was set in a scowl, but Hawk had worked with Thompson long enough to recognize when the chief was more curious than angry. Chief Thompson, Sarah said carefully, is there a problem with my work? Thompson stopped directly in front of her, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. Hell no, there's no problem with your work. Best damn cleaning I've seen in 20 years. These jets haven't been this spotless since they rolled off the production line. He paused, crossing his arms. The question is, why does a former strike Fighter pilot know exactly where every sensitive system is located on an FA-18? Sarah's shoulders sagged slightly. How did you know who you are? Thompson's scowl softened into something that might have been a smile. Phoenix, I was at Lemoore when you were there for your first fleet squadron. Watch you work on your bird during pre-flight checks. You had the same way of moving around the aircraft than that you do now. Respectful, but familiar. Like you were. Greeting an old friend. Hawk found himself holding his breath as he watched this interaction unfold. Thompson commanded enormous respect throughout the aviation community. If he was vouching for Sarah's credentials, it carried significant weight. I was a maintenance officer for my squadron, Sarah said quietly. I like to know how everything worked. Like to know? Thompson snorted. Phoenix, you probably knew those birds better than half my mechanics. I heard you could troubleshoot hydraulic problems just by listening to the engine. That's not exactly a rare skill, Sarah protested. It is when you're also one of the best stick and rudder pilots of your generation, Hawk interjected. Most pilots are either great flyers or great maintainers. Very few excel at both. Thompson nodded approvingly. That's what made her special. Phoenix understood that the aircraft wasn't just a machine, it was a partner. You can't fly at that level without that kind of connection. Sarah looked between the two men, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Look, I appreciate the kind words, but that's all in the past. I'm not that pilot anymore. Bullshit, Thompson said bluntly. You don't stop being a pilot just because some desk jockey says you can't fly. The skills are still there. The instincts are still there. The knowledge is still there. But the medical clearance isn't, Sarah replied firmly. And without that, nothing else matters. Thompson exchanged a meaningful glance with Hawk. You know, Phoenix, there are ways to stay involved in aviation that don't require medical clearance. Like what? Training, Hawk said. Simulation. Flight instruction for civilian pilots. Hell, even test flying for defense contractors doesn't always require military medical clearance. Sarah shook her head. I've looked into all of that. My discharge papers follow me everywhere. Insurance companies won't touch me. Training facilities won't hire me. The PTSD diagnosis makes me unemployable in aviation. That's because you're thinking inside the system, Thompson said. But there are people working outside the system who might be interested in your particular skill set. What do you mean? The Top Gun patch felt heavy in her pocket, like a piece of her past that refused to stay buried. As she worked, Sarah found herself remembering not just the crash and the medical boards, but the pure joy she'd once found in the sky, the feeling of freedom that came with every takeoff, the satisfaction of a perfect landing, the brotherhood of pilots who understood that flying wasn't just a job, it was a calling. Maybe Morrison was right. Maybe this conversation wasn't over. Maybe it was just beginning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The coffee in the squadron-ready room had gone cold an hour ago, but Lieutenant Commander Ryan Hawk Patterson kept nursing it anyway. Across the room, Morrison was briefing the morning's flight schedule, but Hawk's attention kept drifting to Code Avesté and to drifting to Brute, the maintenance bay visible through the windows. He could see the cleaning lady, Sarah Morrison had said her name, was methodically working her way around the aircraft. You're staring again, whispered Lieutenant Maria Viper Rodriguez, sliding into the seat next to him. At 28, she was the youngest pilot in VF-31 and had something to prove every single day. Her dark eyes followed Hawk's gaze to the hangar floor below. Morrison wasn't kidding, was he? Hawk murmured. About who she is? Viper shook her head. I looked it up on my tablet during the brief. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, call sign Phoenix. The rescue over the Pacific wasn't the only thing she was famous for. She had the highest gunnery scores in her class at TOPGUN, Flew combat missions over Syria in 2018 and 2019. 2 air-to-air kills confirmed. 2 kills? Hawk raised an eyebrow. That puts her in pretty exclusive company. Gets better, Viper. Continued, scrolling through her tablet. She was being fast-tracked for squadron command. Word was she was going to be the youngest female commanding officer in the strike fighter community. Hawk watched as Sarah carefully maneuvered her cart around the landing gear of aircraft 104. Even from this distance, he could see the precision in her movements, the way she avoided the sensitive equipment without needing to look. Most civilians would have bumped into something by now, so what happened? He asked. Morrison said medical discharge, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Viper's expression grew serious. That's where it gets complicated. The official record just says medical retirement for service-related conditions, but I found some news. Articles from around that time. Apparently, the rescue mission took longer than anyone reported. She was in the air for almost 14 hours straight, coordinating between multiple agencies, making impossible approaches to unstable platforms. By the time it was over, she'd pushed her aircraft and herself far beyond normal operational limits. 14 hours in a Hornet? Hawk's eyes widened. That's physically brutal, the fatigue alone. But that wasn't what broke her, Viper said quietly. According to one article, she made 17 rescue runs to different crash sites. 17. Each time she had to watch people die that she couldn't save. The psychological evaluation must have been devastating. Morrison's voice cut through. Their whispered conversation. Gentlemen, ladies, if we're done with the side discussions, we have a flight schedule to review. Hawk straightened in his chair, but his mind was still processing what Viper had told him. 17 rescue runs. He tried to imagine the mental toll of witnessing that much tragedy, of being responsible for coordinating such a massive operation while flying a single seat fighter jet for 14 straight hours. After the briefing concluded, Hawk found himself walking toward the hangar instead of the flight line. He told himself he needed to check on some maintenance issues with his aircraft, but truthfully, he was curious about Sarah Chun. He'd never met a pilot who'd been through what she had experienced. He found her in Bay 3, cleaning around the nose. Gear of aircraft 109. She looked up as he approached, and Hawk could see the wariness in her eyes. Word had clearly spread through the squadron about Morrison's discovery. Lieutenant Commander Patterson, Sarah said formally, recognizing his rank insignia. Is there something wrong with the aircraft? Please call me Hawk, he said, trying to put her at ease. And no, nothing's wrong. I was just curious to meet you properly. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly. There's nothing to meet, sir. I'm just here to clean the hangar. Hawk studied her face, noting the way she held herself. Despite the civilian clothes and the mop in her hands, there was still something unmistakably military in her bearing. The straight shoulders, the direct eye contact, the way she positioned herself with a clear line of retreat, all habits that died hard. You know, Hawk said conversationally, I was stationed at Norfolk when Flight 47 went down. We were on alert, ready to launch a search and rescue if needed. But by the time we got the order, it was already over. One pilot had coordinated the entire operation single-handedly. That was a team effort, Sarah said quietly. The Coast Guard, Navy rescue swimmers, merchant vessels in the area, but you were the quarterback, Hawk interrupted gently. You were the one making the calls, directing the chaos. I read the after-action reports. Without your coordination, hundreds more people would have died. Sarah's knuckles were white where she gripped the mop handle. Those reports are classified. I have the clearance, Hawk replied, and curiosity. It's not often you meet someone who's redefined what a single pilot can accomplish. For a moment, Sarah's carefully constructed facade slipped, and Hawk caught a glimpse of the pain underneath. It was gone almost instantly, replaced by that practiced neutrality. That pilot doesn't exist anymore, Sarah said. She was retired. For medical reasons, retired maybe, but she's still in there. Hawk gestured toward her chest. I can see it in the way you move around these aircraft. You know them. You respect them. Most civilians are intimidated by fighter jets, but you clean around them like you've lived with them your whole life. I have lived with them, Sarah admitted. Just not the way I used to. Before Hawk could respond, another voice interrupted from across the hangar. Phoenix. Both Hawk and Sarah turned to see a grizzled Master Chief Petty Officer striding toward them. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Wrench Thompson was a legend in naval aviation maintenance, with 32 years of service and hands that could diagnose engine problems by touch alone. His weathered face was set in a scowl, but Hawk had worked with Thompson long enough to recognize when the chief was more curious than angry. Chief Thompson, Sarah said carefully, is there a problem with my work? Thompson stopped directly in front of her, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. Hell no, there's no problem with your work. Best damn cleaning I've seen in 20 years. These jets haven't been this spotless since they rolled off the production line. He paused, crossing his arms. The question is, why does a former strike fighter pilot know exactly where every sensitive system is located on an FA-18? Sarah's shoulders sagged slightly. How did you know who you are? Thompson's scowl softened into something that might have been a smile. Phoenix, I was at Lemoore when you were there for your first fleet squadron. Watch you work on your bird during pre-flight checks. You had the same way of moving around the aircraft than that you do now. Respectful, but familiar. Like you were greeting an old friend. Hawk found himself holding his breath as he watched this interaction unfold. Thompson commanded enormous respect throughout the aviation community. If he was vouching for Sarah's credentials, it carried significant weight. I was a maintenance officer for my squadron, Sarah said quietly. I like to know how everything worked. Like to know? Thompson snorted. Phoenix, you probably knew those birds better than half my mechanics. I heard you could troubleshoot hydraulic problems just by listening to the engine. That's not exactly a rare skill, Sarah protested. It is when you're also one of the best stick and rudder pilots of your generation, Hawk interjected. Most pilots are either great flyers or great maintainers. Very few excel at both. Thompson nodded approvingly. That's what made her special. Phoenix understood that the aircraft wasn't just a machine. It was a partner. You can't fly at that level without that kind of connection. Sarah looked between the two men, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Look, I appreciate the kind words, but that's all in the past. I'm not that pilot anymore. Bullshit, Thompson said bluntly. You don't stop being a pilot just because some desk jockey says you can't fly. The skills are still there. The instincts are still there. The knowledge is still there. But the medical clearance isn't, Sarah replied firmly. And without that, nothing else matters. Thompson exchanged a meaningful glance with Hawk. You know, Phoenix, there are ways to stay involved in aviation that don't require medical clearance. Like what? Training, Hawk said. Simulation. Flight instruction for civilian pilots. Hell, even test flying for defense contractors doesn't always require military medical clearance. Sarah shook her head. I've looked into all of that. My discharge papers follow me everywhere. Insurance companies won't touch me. Training facilities won't hire me. The PTSD diagnosis makes me unemployable in aviation. That's because you're thinking inside the system, Thompson said. But there are people working outside the system who might be interested in your particular skill set. What do you mean? Thompson glanced around the hangar, making sure they weren't being overheard. There's a company out of Nevada. Defense contractor. They do experimental flight testing, adversary training for military units, that sort of thing. They're less concerned with medical bureaucracy and more concerned with capability. "Chief," Sarah said warningly, "if you're suggesting something illegal—" "Nothing illegal," Thompson assured her. "Just an alternative. These guys contract with the military to provide realistic training scenarios. They need pilots who can think. Like the enemy, who can push aircraft to their limits, who can improvise when everything goes to hell." Hawk felt a spark of excitement. "You're talking about red flag training. Aggressor squadrons." "Among other things," Thompson confirmed. "The point is, they judge pilots by what they can do, not what some medical board says they can't do." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Hawk could see the internal struggle playing out on her face, hope warring with caution, desire battling with fear. "Even if what you're saying is true," she said finally, "I haven't flown in over 3 years. My skills are probably rusty, my confidence is shot, and I have no way to prove I can still perform at that level." "Actually," Hawk said slowly, "you might have more opportunities than you think." Both Sarah and Thompson looked at him questioningly. "There's a red flag exercise coming up next month at Nellis," Hawk continued. "VFA 31 is scheduled to participate. We'll need aggressor pilots to play the bad guys during training scenarios. It's all contract work, civilian pilots flying military aircraft in controlled environments." Sarah's eyes widened. "You're suggesting I apply to be an aggressor pilot?" "I'm suggesting you consider it," Hawk replied carefully. "The company Thompson mentioned, Tactical Air Solutions, provides pilots for exactly these kinds of exercises. They're always looking for experienced military aviators, especially ones with combat experience and Top Gun training." "But my medical status wouldn't be relevant," Thompson interrupted. "Contractors have different medical standards than active military. As long as you can pass a basic physical and demonstrate competency in the cockpit, they don't care what happened with your military discharge." Sarah leaned against the aircraft's landing gear, her mind clearly racing. Hawk could see this spark of possibility beginning to kindle in her eyes, fighting against years of disappointment and self-doubt. "I don't even know if I remember how to fly," she said quietly. "Phoenix," Thompson said gently, "flying is like breathing for pilots like you. The muscle memory is still there. The instincts are still there. You just need the opportunity to prove it." "What would I have to do?" Sarah asked, almost despite herself. Hawk and Thompson exchanged another glance. They were both thinking the same thing. They might have just found a way to get Phoenix back in the air where she belonged. The first step would be a conversation with the right people, Hawk said. "I have contacts at Tactical Air Solutions. They're always interested in talking to former Top Gun pilots. And if they're interested, then you have to prove you can still fly," Thompson said simply. "But something tells me that won't be a problem." For the first time since Morrison had discovered her secret, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. It was tentative and fragile, but it was real. "How long do I have to think about it?" she asked. "Red flag starts in 6 weeks, Hawk replied. "So not long." "But Phoenix ... If you're even considering this, you should know that once word gets out that you're back in the air, there's no going back to being invisible." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding the implications. The careful anonymity she'd maintained for 3 years would be shattered. She'd be Phoenix again, with all the expectations and pressures that came with that identity. But as she looked up at the sleek fighter jet towering above them, Hawk could see the decision already forming in her eyes. Some people were meant to fly, and no amount of bureaucracy or medical boards could change that fundamental truth. "I'll think about it," Sarah said finally. "Don't think too long," Thompson advised. "The sky's been waiting for you to come home." As the 3 of them stood in the shadow of the FA-18, Hawk realized they had just witnessed something significant. Not just the possible resurrection of a pilot's career, but the moment when Sarah Chun stopped running from who she used to be and started considering who she might become again. The ripple effect that had started with Morrison's discovery was spreading, and Hawk had the feeling it was about to become a wave. 3 days had passed since Hawk's conversation with Sarah about tactical air solutions, and the weight of possibility hung over her like storm clouds. She'd barely slept, her mind cycling through scenarios, fears, and half-forgotten memories of what it felt like to pull 6 Gs in a vertical climb. The cleaning routine that had once provided mindless comfort now felt like a prison sentence. Captain Rebecca Steele Martinez had been watching the unusual activity in her hangar with growing curiosity. As commanding officer of VFA 31, she made it her business to know everything that happened in her squadron, and the whispered conversations about the janitor were impossible to ignore. When she finally cornered Morrison in her office that Thursday morning, she was prepared for answers. "Jake, explain to me why half my pilots are suddenly fascinated with our cleaning staff," Steele said, settling behind her desk with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold twice. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. At 34, he was one of the more experienced pilots in the squadron, but Steele still intimidated him. She'd earned her call sign during combat operations over Afghanistan, where her ability to make split-second decisions under fire had saved countless lives. There wasn't much that rattled her, which made her current interest in Sarah Chun particularly significant. "Ma'am, it's complicated," Morrison began. "Uncomplicated," Steele replied flatly. Morrison took a breath and told her everything, the top gun patch, Sarah's identity, the conversations with Hawk and Chief Thompson, and the possibility of contract work with Tactical Air Solutions. When he finished, Steele was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her desk. "Phoenix," she said finally. "I remember that call sign." The Pacific Rescue was front-page news in Navy Times. Every aviator in the fleet was talking about it. "Yes, ma'am, and now she's cleaning our hangar floors." Steele stood and walked to her window, which overlooked the flight line. She could see Sarah in the distance, methodically working her way around aircraft 103. From this angle, there was nothing remarkable about her, just another civilian employee doing her job. But Steele had learned to look beyond appearances. "What's your assessment, Jake? Is she still capable?" Morrison considered the question carefully. "Honestly, ma'am, I think she's more capable than she knows. The way she moves around the aircraft, the questions she asks when she thinks no one's listening, she's still thinking like a pilot. The knowledge is there. The instincts are there. But she's scared. The medical discharge hit her hard, and she's built walls around herself to avoid getting hurt again. Breaking through those walls won't be easy." Steele nodded thoughtfully. "What does Chief Thompson think?" "He's convinced she belongs back in the cockpit. He's been trying to convince her to contact Tactical Air Solutions. And she's considering it, but she's not ready to commit. I think she needs to prove to herself that she can still fly before she take that leap." Steele turned from the window with a decisive expression that Morrison recognized. It was the same look she got before making the kind of command decision that either saved the day or landed everyone in trouble. "Jake, I want you to arrange something for me." "Ma'am?" "This weekend, I want Sarah Chun in the squadron's T-45 trainer. Unofficial flight, just to see if she still got it." Morrison's eyes widened. "Ma'am, she doesn't have medical clearance. If something happens, nothing's going to happen. And technically she won't be flying, she'd be consulting on aircraft systems. The fact that the aircraft happens to leave the ground during this consultation is purely coincidental." Morrison grinned despite himself. "You want me to ask her to take an unauthorized flight in a military training aircraft to prove she can still fly? I want you to offer her the chance to find out if 3 years on the ground have killed the pilot in her or just put her to sleep. And if she says no," Steele's expression grew serious, "then we respect her decision and never speak of it again. But Jake, if there's even a chance that Phoenix can come back from this, we owe it to her, and to the aviation community to find out. Morrison nodded, understanding the gravity of what Steele was proposing. It wasn't just about Sarah's future. It was about the principle that exceptional pilots shouldn't be thrown away because of bureaucratic decisions made by people who'd never felt the rush of breaking the sound barrier. "I'll talk to her," Morrison said. "Good. And Jake?" This conversation never happened. An hour later, Morrison found Sarah in Hangar 4, carefully cleaning around the ejection seat of aircraft 108. She looked up as he approached, and he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. The internal struggle was wearing on her. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said quietly. She set down her cleaning supplies and followed him to a quiet corner of the hangar, away from the maintenance crews and other personnel. "I've been thinking about what Hawk said," Sarah began before Morrison could speak, "about the contract work. I looked up tactical air solutions online, and they're legitimate. Defense contractor, good reputation, pilots with strong military backgrounds. But Jake, I'm not ready for something like that. I don't know if I'll ever be ready." Morrison nodded understandingly. "What if you could find out? What if you could know for certain whether you still have what it takes?" Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you suggesting?" "Hypothetically," Morrison said carefully, "if someone were to offer you the chance to get back in a cockpit, just once, just to see, would you take it?" Sarah's breath caught. "Jake, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about this Saturday. Dawn Patrol. T-45 Goshawk trainer. 2 seats, dual controls, experienced instructor pilot." Morrison paused. "I'm talking about finding out if Phoenix is still in there." Sarah stared at him as if he'd suggested they steal the space shuttle. "That's impossible. I don't have clearance. I don't have current physicals. I don't even have a flight suit that fits." "We can solve the flight suit problem," Morrison said. "As for the rest, sometimes you have to be willing to bend rules to do the right thing." "Bend rules?" "Jake, what you're describing isn't bending rules, it's breaking them into tiny pieces." Morrison stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Sarah, 3 years ago, you broke every rule in the book to save 247 people. You flew a damaged fighter jet for 14 hours straight, made approaches that violated every safety protocol ever written, and coordinated a rescue operation that had no right to succeed. Don't tell me you're suddenly worried about following regulations." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Morrison could see the conflict playing out in her expression. Fear and desire, caution and desperation, all warring for control. "Even if I wanted to," she said finally, "even if I was willing to take that risk, what makes you think I can still fly? It's been 3 years, Jake. 3 years since I've touched the controls of anything more complex than a vacuum cleaner." "Flying is like riding a bicycle," Morrison said. "You never really forget. Flying a bicycle doesn't require split-second decisions at 500 knots. Sarah replied tartly, despite her objections. Morrison could hear something in her voice that hadn't been there before, a spark of the old Phoenix, the pilot who'd never backed down from a challenge. "Tell me something," Morrison said. "When you're cleaning around these jets, do you ever imagine what it would feel like to be back in the cockpit?" Sarah's silence was enough. "Do you ever catch yourself running through pre-flight checklists in your head? Do you ever listen to the engine sounds and automatically diagnose system performance? Do you ever look up at contrails and feel that ache in your chest?" "Stop," Sarah whispered. "Because if you do," Morrison continued relentlessly, "then you're still a pilot. Everything else is just paperwork." Sarah turned away from him, staring up at the FSA-18 towering above them. Morrison watched her shoulders rise and fall with deep, controlled breathing, the same kind of breathing pilots use to manage stress and focus their minds. "If I did this," she said without turning around, "and if something went wrong—" "Nothing will go wrong," Morrison said firmly. "We'll start slow, basic maneuvers. get you comfortable with the controls again. If you want to stop at any point, we stop, no questions asked. And if I freeze up? If the PTSD kicks in, Morrison considered this seriously. Then we land, and we never speak of it again. But Sarah, what if you don't freeze up? What if you remember why you fell in love with flying in the first place? Sarah was quiet for so long that Morrison began to think she was going to refuse. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. What time is Saturday? Morrison felt his heart rate spike. Dawn, 0600 hours. Less air traffic, fewer questions. Sarah nodded slowly. I'll need to think about this. Don't think too long, Morrison said gently. Sometimes the best decisions are the ones you make before you have time to talk yourself out of them. As Morrison walked away, he felt a mixture of excitement and terror. He'd just committed to putting an unqualified pilot in a military aircraft, the kind of decision that could end careers and destroy lives if anything went wrong. But as he thought about the spark he'd seen in Sarah's eyes, he knew it was the right thing to do. Sarah remained by the aircraft for another 20 minutes after Morrison left, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears. She found herself running through memory exercises she hadn't done in years: emergency procedures, system limitations, performance parameters. The information was all still there, filed away in the corners of her mind, like books in a library that hadn't been visited but never forgotten. That night, Sarah lay in her small apartment staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She'd pulled out her old flight gear from a closet where it had been gathering dust: helmet, gloves, flight publications that were probably outdated, but still familiar. Touching them brought back a flood of sensory memories: the weight of the helmet, the feel of the stick in her hands, the indescribable sensation of pulling back on the throttles and feeling the aircraft respond like an extension of her own body. By Friday evening, her decision was made. Saturday morning arrived gray and overcast, with low clouds that seemed to mirror Sarah's emotional state. She stood at the edge of the flight line at 0545, wearing a borrowed flight suit that was slightly too large and carrying a helmet that felt both familiar and foreign in her hands. Morrison appeared out of the pre-dawn gloom, his own flight gear, making him look like the professional military aviator he was. Behind him, the T-45 Goshawk sat on the tarmac like a predator waiting to pounce. The training aircraft was smaller than the FA-18 Sarah was used to, but it was still a capable machine, and more importantly, it was airworthy. You came, Morrison said, unable to hide his relief. I'm here, Sarah replied. But Jake, I want you to know that I'm terrified. Good, Morrison said. Fear keeps you sharp. It's when you stop being afraid that you get careless. They walked toward the aircraft together, their footsteps echoing across the empty tarmac. Sarah's hands were trembling slightly, but she forced herself to focus on the familiar routine of pre-flight inspection. Muscle memory took over as she checked control surfaces, examined the engine intake, and verified that all external systems appeared normal. She looks good, Sarah said, running her hand along the aircraft's wing. Maintenance is keeping her in excellent condition. Chief Thompson made sure of that, Morrison replied. He wanted everything perfect for today. Sarah looked at him sharply. Thompson knows about this? Thompson suggested it, Morrison admitted. He said if we were going to find out whether Phoenix was still alive, we needed to do it properly. As they completed the pre-flight inspection, Sarah felt something stirring inside her that she'd almost forgotten existed: anticipation, mixed with professional competence. She was remembering not just how to fly, but why she'd loved it so much. Ready? Morrison asked as they reached the boarding ladder. Sarah looked up at the cockpit, then at the gray sky above them. Somewhere up there, beyond the clouds, was the world she'd once called home. Let's find out, she said, and began to climb. The T-45's cockpit felt both foreign and familiar as Sarah strapped herself into the rear seat. Her fingers moved automatically through the harness sequence, muscle memory overriding 3 years of dormancy. The smell hit her first, a mixture of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and that indefinable scent of high-performance machinery that every pilot recognized instantly. It was the smell of possibility. "Comes check," Morrison's voice crackled through. The intercom from the front seat. "Phoenix ... "Sarah copies," she replied, catching herself before using her old call sign. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Today you're Phoenix," Morrison said firmly. "Sarah is the woman who cleans hangars. Phoenix is the one who flies." As Morrison ran through the pre-start checklist, Sarah found herself anticipating each step. Her hands hovered over controls she hadn't touched in years, but the knowledge was still there, embedded in neural pathways that time couldn't erase. When Morrison called for the auxiliary power unit to start, Sarah's finger was already moving toward the switch before she consciously remembered where it was. "Engine start checklist," Morrison announced. Sarah closed her eyes and let the familiar rhythm wash over her. Fuel pumps on, ignition ready. The throttle cracked. The Rolls-Royce engine spooled up with a whine that crescendoed into a steady roar, and Sarah felt something inside her chest that she'd thought was dead forever pure. Undiluted joy. "Tower, Navy 204 requesting taxi for local training flight," Morrison transmitted. "Navy 204, taxi to runway 24 left, winds 240 at 8, altimeter 30.12. The T-45 began to roll, and Sarah's hands instinctively moved to the secondary controls. She wasn't flying yet, but she was connected to the aircraft, feeling its weight and balance through the seat of her pants. It was like greeting an old friend after a long absence. "How are you doing back there?" Morrison asked as they approached the runway. "Scared out of my mind," Sarah admitted, "but also, God, Jake, I'd forgotten how much I missed this." "We're going to start simple," Morrison explained as they held short of the runway. "Basic flight maneuvers, gentle turns, nothing aggressive. You tell me if you need to stop at any point." "Understood." "Tower, Navy 204 ready for takeoff." "Navy 204, cleared for takeoff, runway 24 left." Morrison advanced the throttle, and the T-45 surged forward. Sarah felt the familiar acceleration pressing her back into her seat as the aircraft gained speed. At 120 knots, Morrison pulled back on the stick, and suddenly they were airborne, climbing into the gray morning sky. For Sarah, it was like coming back to life. The ground fell away beneath them, and she watched the familiar landmarks of Miramar shrink into a detailed map. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly to the west, its surface gray-green under the overcast sky. To the east, the mountains of San Diego County rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks lost in low clouds. "Your aircraft," Morrison announced, transferring control to Sarah's stick and rudder pedals. The moment Sarah felt the controls respond to her input, something fundamental shifted inside her. The trembling in her hands stopped, her breathing steadied. 3 years of doubt and self-recrimination fell away like shed skin, and for the first time since the medical board had grounded her, Sarah Chun felt like herself again. "I have the aircraft," she confirmed, her voice now carrying the crisp confidence of a trained aviator. She started with simple maneuvers, gentle turns, altitude changes, basic handling characteristics. The T-45 responded beautifully, its controls lighter than the FA-18S she was used to, but precise and predictable. With each passing minute, Sarah's confidence grew. Her hands remembered the delicate touch required for smooth flight. Her feet found the rhythm of rudder coordination, and her eyes automatically began scanning instruments in sky with the systematic precision that had once made her one of the Navy's top pilots. "Feeling good?" Morrison asked. "Feeling like I never left," Sarah replied, and she meant it. "Let's try something a little more interesting. Think you're ready for some aerobatics?" Sarah's pulse quickened. Aerobatic maneuvering required split-second timing, perfect coordination, and absolute trust in both the aircraft and her own abilities. It was also the purest expression of what it meant to be a pilot. "Let's do it," she said. "Your aircraft. Take us up to 8,000 feet and show me an aileron roll." Sarah pulled back on the stick and advanced the throttle, feeling the T-45 climb eagerly toward the cloud deck. At 8,000 feet, she leveled off and took a deep breath. An aileron roll was basic aerobatics, something she'd done thousands of times. But after 3 years on the ground, it felt like stepping off a cliff. She pushed the stick forward slightly to gain airspeed, then pulled it back to establish a slight climb attitude. With one smooth motion, she rolled the stick full left and applied forward pressure to maintain the nose position. The T-45 rotated around its longitudinal axis with balletic grace, the horizon spinning past the canopy in a controlled blur. Earth became sky became Earth again, and suddenly they were wings level, still climbing as if nothing had happened. "Beautiful," Morrison breathed. "Textbook perfect, again." Sarah rolled right this time, then left again, finding her rhythm. Each maneuver felt better than the last, her confidence building with every successful completion. The fear that had plagued her for 3 years was evaporating, replaced by the familiar rush of controlling a high-performance aircraft with precision and grace. "How about a loop?" Morrison suggested. A loop was more complex. It required careful energy management, precise control inputs, and perfect timing to avoid overstressing the aircraft. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, then committed fully. She pushed the throttle forward and dove slightly to build airspeed, then pulled back firmly on the stick. The T-45's nose tracked up through the horizon, through vertically, and continued climbing toward the inverted position. At the top of the loop, Sarah was hanging in her harness, looking down at the earth through the top of the canopy, the blood rushing to her head as G-forces built. She eased the back pressure slightly, allowing the aircraft to track through the remainder of the circle, until suddenly they were upright again, wings level, having traced a perfect vertical circle in the sky. "Flawless," Morrison said, and Sarah could hear the amazement in his voice. "Phoenix, it's like you never stopped flying." Sarah felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness or fear, but from pure relief. She could still fly. After 3 years of wondering, 3 years of doubt and self-recrimination, she had her answer. The medical board could ground her plane, but they couldn't ground her soul. "Jake," she said quietly, "I want to try something." "What do you have in mind?" Sarah's voice grew serious. "I want to recreate the approach I made during the Pacific rescue. The one that got me grounded." Morrison was quiet for a moment. "Phoenix, are you sure? That was a traumatic experience. If it triggers—" "I need to know if I can still do it," Sarah interrupted. "I need to know if I can handle high-stress situations without falling apart." Morrison considered this carefully. The approach Sarah was referring to had been written up in textbooks as an example of exceptional airmanship under impossible conditions. She had landed a damaged F-A-18 on the deck of a cargo ship in heavy seas, using techniques that violated every safety protocol in the book, but had somehow worked. It was the kind of flying that separated exceptional pilots from merely good ones. "Okay," Morrison said finally. "But we do it safely. No actual emergency conditions, just the maneuvering profile." "Understood." Sarah climbed to 15,000 feet and set up an approach scenario similar to what she'd faced 3 years ago. She throttled back to idle and began a steep descent, simulating an aircraft with limited power. At 10,000 feet, she started a series of S-turns, demonstrating the precise energy management that had allowed her to land on a moving platform in rough seas. As she flew, Sarah found herself back in that cockpit 3 years ago, but this time without the terror and desperation that had marked the original event. She could appreciate the technical aspects of what she'd accomplished, The way she'd used aerodynamic principles to overcome mechanical limitations. The split-second calculations that had allowed her to land safely in impossible conditions. At 3,000 feet, she leveled off and smoothly transitioned to normal flight, having successfully recreated one of the most challenging approaches in recent naval aviation history. "That was incredible," Morrison said. "Phoenix, I've been flying for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like that. The precision, the control, you made it look effortless." Sarah felt a weight she'd carried for 3 years finally lifting from her shoulders. "I can still do it, Jake. Whatever they said about me, whatever the medical board decided, I can still fly." "Better than ever," Morrison confirmed. "Phoenix, you need to seriously consider that job with Tactical Air Solutions. The aviation world needs pilots like you." As they headed back toward Miramar, Sarah's mind was already racing with possibilities. For the first time in 3 years, she was thinking about the future instead of dwelling on the past. The unauthorized flight had answered the question that had haunted her since her discharge. She was still a pilot, still capable of exceptional performance under pressure. "Jake," she said as they began their descent, "when we land, I want you to give me the contact information for Tactical Air Solutions." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. It's time for Phoenix to come home." The landing was perfect, a gentle touchdown that barely registered through the aircraft structure. As they taxied back to the hangar, Sarah felt transformed. The woman who had climbed into the T-45 an hour ago had been broken, uncertain, afraid. The woman who climbed out was a pilot again. Chief Thompson was waiting by the hangar when they shut down the engines. His weathered face was impassive, but Sarah could see the satisfaction in his eyes. "How'd it go?" he asked simply. "Like riding a bicycle," Sarah replied, and for the first time in 3 years, she was smiling. Thompson nodded approvingly. "Figured as much. Phoenix, there's someone here who wants to meet you." Sarah looked past Thompson and saw a man in civilian clothes standing near the hangar entrance. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with the bearing of someone who'd spent serious time in military aviation. Even from a distance, she could tell he was sizing her up with the practiced eye of a pilot evaluator. "Colonel Marcus Venom Hayes, retired," Thompson said, by way of introduction. "He runs flight operations for Tactical Air Solutions." Hayes stepped forward and extended his hand. "Miss Chun, I've heard a lot about you. Jake Morrison called me this morning and suggested I might want to drive down from Nevada to see what all the fuss was about." Sarah shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. "Colonel Hayes, I have to ask, how much did you see?" Hayes smiled. "Enough to know that reports of your flying skills weren't exaggerated. That approach sequence you demonstrated, I've seen the classified footage from the Pacific Rescue. What you just did was every bit as impressive." "You've seen the footage?" "I have the clearance," Hayes confirmed. "And the professional interest." Tactical Air Solutions specializes in providing realistic training scenarios for military units. "We need pilots who can think outside the box, who can perform at the edge of the envelope when the situation demands it." Sarah felt her pulse quickening. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a chance to prove you deserve one," Hayes replied. "Next month's Red Flag exercise at Nellis. We're providing aggressor pilots to play the enemy in training scenarios. It's demanding work. You'll be flying against some of the best pilots in the world, and you'll be expected to make them look bad. And if I can do that?" Hayes' smile widened. "Then we'll talk about making it permanent. The pay is good. The flying is challenging, and you'll be working with pilots who judge you by what you can do in the cockpit, not what's written on your medical records." Sarah looked around the hangar at Morrison, Thompson, and the aircraft. That had been both her prison and her salvation for the past 8 months. Then she looked back at Hayes. "When do we start?" The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a moonscape of sagebrush and distant mountains shimmering in the pre-dawn heat. Nellis Air Force Base sat in the middle of this vastness. Like a technological oasis, its runways and hangars buzzing with activity as Red Flag 24-3 prepared to commence. Sarah stood on the tarmac at 0430 hours, her new flight suit crisp and unmarked, watching as some of the most advanced military aircraft in the world prepared for what would be the most challenging month of her life. It had been 3 weeks since Colonel Hayes had offered her the position with Tactical Air Solutions, and every day since had been a whirlwind of preparation. Medical evaluations with civilian doctors who cared more about her current capabilities than her past diagnosis. Simulator sessions in Las Vegas to familiarize herself with the F-16 Fighting Falcon, the aircraft she'd be flying as an aggressor pilot. Intensive briefings on threat replication, adversary tactics, and the complex rules of engagement that governed Red Flag exercises. Now, surrounded by F-22 Raptors, F-35 Lightning E's, and a dozen other types of advanced fighters, Sarah felt the familiar pre-mission butterflies that every pilot knew but rarely admitted to feeling. Today wasn't just about flying, it was about proving that Phoenix belonged in this elite community. Nervous? Asked Captain Amanda Razor Blake, walking up beside her. At 29, Razor was Tactical Air Solutions lead aggressor pilot. A former Air Force Academy graduate who'd left active duty to pursue the more flexible lifestyle of contract flying. She'd been assigned as Sarah's mentor for the exercise, and over the past week, the two women had developed a mutual respect based on their shared understanding of what it meant to be female pilots in a male-dominated field. Terrified, Sarah admitted. It's one thing to fly a trainer aircraft in uncontrolled airspace. It's another thing entirely to go up against F-22s with 20-something pilots who think they're invincible. Razor laughed. That's exactly the attitude that's going to make you effective out there. The overconfident ones are the easiest to kill. They make mistakes because they assume their technology will save them. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. The F-16C she'd be flying was a capable aircraft, but it was also 20 years older than some of the fighters she'd be facing. Success would depend entirely on pilot skill, tactical awareness, and the ability to think 3 moves ahead of her opponents. Aggressor pilots, time for mission brief, came the announcement over the hangar's public address system. Sarah and Razor joined 8 other contract pilots in a windowless briefing room that smelled of coffee and aviation fuel. At the front of the room stood Lieutenant Colonel David Reaper Sullivan, the Red Flag exercise director. Sullivan was a legend in the fighter community, a former weapons school instructor with over 3,000 fighter hours and a reputation for creating training scenarios that pushed pilots to their absolute limits. Ladies and gentlemen, Sullivan began, welcome to Red Flag 24-3. For the next 4 weeks, you're going to make life very difficult for some of the finest pilots in the world. Your job is to replicate the tactics, techniques, and procedures of potential adversaries. You will be aggressive, you will be unpredictable, and you will be professional. He clicked to the first slide of his presentation, showing an aerial overview of the Nevada Test and Training Range. Today's scenario: defense of a strategic target against a coordinated strike package. Blue Force consists of 8 F-35s, 4 F-22s, and supporting electronic warfare assets. Red Force, that's you, will defend with 6 F-16s, using threat representative tactics. Sarah studied the tactical display, her mind automatically beginning to process the geometry of the engagement. The Blue Force had superior numbers and technology, but the Red Force had the advantage of fighting defensively from prepared positions. It would be a chess match played at 500 knots and 30,000 feet. Phoenix, Sullivan said, addressing Sarah directly. You'll be flying as Red 3, wingman to Razor. Your primary responsibility is mutual support and situational awareness. Do not try to be a hero on your first day. Understood, sir, Sarah replied. After the briefing, the aggressor pilots dispersed to their aircraft for pre-flight preparations. Sarah's F-16C sat in a revetment at the far end of the flight line. Its gray and tan desert camouflage paint scheme designed to blend into the Nevada landscape. Unlike the sleek modern fighters she'd grown accustomed to, the F-16 had a utilitarian appearance that spoke to its role as a proven workhorse of modern air combat. Chief Master Sergeant Tony Wrench Rodriguez supervised Sarah's pre-flight inspection with the critical eye of someone who'd been maintaining fighter aircraft since before she was born. At 54, Rodriguez had seen every type of pilot imaginable: rookies who thought they knew everything, veterans who'd forgotten more than most people ever learned, and the rare few who possessed that indefinable quality that separated the good from the great. "First time in a Viper?" Rodriguez asked, using the F-16's unofficial nickname. "First time in anything this advanced," Sarah admitted. "I trained on FA-18s, but this is a different beast entirely." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "Good attitude. Respect the aircraft, and it'll take care of you. Push it beyond its limits, and it'll remind you who's really in charge." As Sarah completed her walk-around inspection, she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been invisible, cleaning hangar floors and trying to forget she'd ever been a pilot. Now she was preparing to engage in simulated combat against some of the most advanced fighters ever built. The transformation seemed almost impossible to believe. "Phoenix, you ready?" Razor called from her adjacent aircraft. "Ready as I'll ever be," Sarah replied. Climbing into the F-16's cockpit, the familiar routine of strapping in and running through pre-start checklists helped calm her nerves. The F-16's cockpit was more cramped than the FSA-18's, but the layout was logical and well-designed. Within minutes, she had the engine running and was ready to taxi. "Nellis ground, red flight ready to taxi," Razor transmitted. "Red flight, taxi. 2 runway 21, left via Alpha, Charlie. Contact tower when ready." The 6 F-16s taxied in formation toward the active runway, their engines creating heat distortions that made the distant mountains shimmer like mirages. Sarah's aircraft felt solid and responsive, the controls perfectly balanced for single seat. Fighter operations. "Tower, red flight ready for takeoff," Razor called as they reached the runway threshold. "Red flight, cleared for takeoff. Fly heading 090, climb and maintain 15,000, contact range. Control on 251.2. Razor's F-16 accelerated down the runway with Sarah close behind, their aircraft lifting off within seconds of each other. The Nevada desert unfolded beneath them as they climbed toward their assigned patrol altitude, the landscape painted in shades of brown and gold under the morning sun. "Range control, red flight checking in. Flight of 6 F-16s at 15,000, Razor transmitted. "Red flight, range control. Proceed to Cap Station Bravo and hold. Blue Force is currently 150 miles southeast, inbound from your position. Expect contact in approximately 20 minutes. Sarah checked her radar display and saw nothing but empty sky. Somewhere out there, 12 of the world's most advanced fighters were approaching, flown by pilots who'd trained their entire careers for this moment. Her job was to deny them their objectives using an aircraft that was older than some of its pilots. "Red 3, how are you feeling?" Razor asked over the radio. "Solid," Sarah replied. "Systems normal, ready to engage." "Good. Remember, we're not trying to win a furball. We're trying to force Blue Force to make mistakes. Use your radar conservatively, stay unpredictable, and trust your wingmen." Over the next 15 minutes, the Red Force fighters positioned themselves in a defensive formation designed to maximize their coverage of the target area while minimizing their exposure to long-range missile shots. Sarah found herself falling back into the rhythms of tactical flying, constant radar sweeps, altitude changes to confuse enemy tracking, and the hypervigilance that came with knowing that somewhere in the vast sky around her, hostile aircraft were hunting. Red flight, range control. Blue force is now 50 miles southeast. Multiple groups, various altitudes. Fights on. Sarah's pulse spiked as her radar warning receiver began chirping, indicating that enemy radars were now actively searching for her aircraft. The tactical display in her cockpit showed multiple contacts approaching from different directions. A coordinated attack designed to split the defender's attention and create opportunities for breakthrough. Red 3. I've got 2 F-35s at your 2 o'clock, 40 miles, Razor called. Turn right to heading 120. Descend to 12,000. Sarah executed the maneuver smoothly, her aircraft responding instantly to her inputs. The F-16 felt different from the F-A-18S. She was used to lighter, more agile, but also more sensitive to control inputs. Every movement had to be precise and deliberate. Red 3 merged, came the call as Sarah's radar acquired the approaching F-35s, engage. What followed was 15 minutes of the most intense flying Sarah had experienced since her active duty days. The engagement developed into a complex three-dimensional chess match, with fighters maneuvering at the limits of human endurance while managing weapon systems, communications, and the constant threat of additional attackers. Sarah found herself locked in a turning fight with an F-35 whose pilot was clearly experienced and aggressive. The stealth fighter had advantages in sensors and weapons, but the F-16's superior turn rate gave Sarah opportunities to force her opponent into defensive positions. She pulled 7 Gs in a climbing spiral, her vision graying at the edges as blood drained from her brain, but she maintained her lock on the F-35 and simulated a successful missile shot. Red 3, good kill on the Lightning, range control announced. Blue 4, you're dead, RTB. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction as the F-35 broke off and headed home. Her first engagement as an aggressor pilot had resulted in a simulated kill against one of the most advanced fighters in the world. Nice work, Phoenix, Razor called. But stay alert, we've got more customers inbound. The next wave consisted of 4 F-22 Raptors, and Sarah quickly discovered that fighting the world's primer air superiority fighter required entirely different tactics. The Raptors were faster, stealthier, and flown by pilots who'd trained specifically to dominate this type of engagement. Sarah found herself constantly defensive, using the F-16's agility to avoid missile shots while looking for opportunities to counterattack. During one particularly intense moment, Sarah found herself in a vertical climb with an F-22, both aircraft, climbing toward 40,000 feet in a deadly game of chicken. The Raptor pilot was trying to use his aircraft's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to gain an advantage, but Sarah countered by using energy management techniques she'd learned during her Top Gun training. At the last possible moment, Sarah rolled, inverted, and pulled through into a split-S maneuver that took her diving toward the desert floor. The F-22 pilot, committed to the vertical fight, couldn't follow her maneuver without overshooting, giving Sarah the separation she needed to reset the engagement geometry. Red 3, outstanding maneuvering, Razor called. You just schooled a Raptor. Driver. The engagement continued for another 10 minutes before range control called, knock it off, indicating the end of the training scenario. As the various fighters sorted themselves out and headed home to Nellis, Sarah felt a familiar post-flight exhaustion mixed with exhilaration. She'd not only survived her first red flag engagement, she'd excelled. Red flight, how copy range? Control for debrief, came the call. Red flight copies, Razor replied. The post-flight debrief was conducted in the same, windowless room where the mission had been briefed hours earlier. Pilots from both sides analyzed their performance using detailed computer reconstructions of the engagement, identifying lessons learned and areas for improvement. When it came time to review Sarah's performance, Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan pulled up her flight track on the main display. Red 3. Let's talk about your engagement with Blue 4. Sarah watched as her aircraft's path was traced across the tactical display, showing every turn, climb, and descent she'd made during the engagement with the F-35. This maneuver here, Sullivan sighed, highlighting a particularly complex series of turns, forced Blue 4 into a defensive position despite his technological advantages. That's exactly the kind of thinking we want to see from our aggressor pilots. Sarah felt a warm flush of pride. Coming from someone of Sullivan's reputation, the praise meant everything. However, Sullivan continued, your subsequent engagement with the Raptors showed some areas for improvement. You were too aggressive in the initial merge, and it nearly cost you. Against fifth-generation fighters, patience is more important than aggression. Sarah nodded, absorbing the critique. Understood, sir. I'll adjust my tactics for tomorrow's mission. Overall, Sullivan concluded, outstanding performance for your first red flag sortie. You flew like someone who belongs here. As the debrief concluded and pilots began dispersing to prepare for the evening mission, Razor caught up with Sarah outside the briefing room. So, she said with a grin, how does it feel to be back? Sarah looked around at the bustling activity of Nellis Air Force base pilots planning missions, maintainers preparing aircraft, the controlled chaos of one of the world's premier training exercises. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. It feels like coming home, she said. 2 years later, Sarah stood in the briefing room at Tactical Air Solutions headquarters in Las Vegas, addressing a room full of young pilots who hung on her every word. The PowerPoint slide behind her showed a tactical diagram from the previous day's training mission, where her aggressor squadron had successfully defeated a combined strike package of F-35s and F-22s, using unconventional tactics that she'd developed during her time at Red Flag. The key to success against fifth-generation fighters, Sarah explained to her audience, isn't trying to match their technology. It's forcing them to fight your fight, not theirs. Make them uncomfortable, disrupt their game plan, and exploit the one advantage that never changes superior pilot skill. Captain James Voodoo Williams, a former Navy pilot who joined Tactical Air Solutions 6 months earlier, raised his hand. Ma'am, how do you develop that level of situational awareness? The way you positioned us yesterday, it was like you could see the entire battle space in your head. Sarah smiled, remembering when she'd asked similar questions as a young pilot. Experience, mostly, but also understanding that every engagement tells a story. Your job is to read that story faster than your opponent and write a better ending. The briefing concluded with assignments for the next day's training evolution, a large force exercise involving aircraft from 3 different military branches. Sarah's aggressor squadron would be playing a near-peer adversary, using tactics and equipment designed to replicate the most challenging threats American forces might face in future conflicts. As the pilots filed out to prepare for their missions, Colonel Hayes approached Sarah with a satisfied expression. In the 2 years since she'd joined the company, Tactical Air Solutions had become the premier provider of advanced adversary training to the U.S. military, largely due to the reputation Sarah had built during her red flag deployments. Phoenix, I've got some news that might interest you, Hayes said, using the call sign that had stuck with her throughout her civilian flying career. The Navy just contracted us for a special project. They want our best pilots to help develop tactics for the new F-40 program. Sarah's eyebrows rose. The F/A-SX was the Navy's next-generation fighter, designed to replace the F/A-18 Super Hornet in the 2030s. Being involved in the development of tactics for such an advanced aircraft would be the pinnacle of any test pilot's career. What's the catch? Sarah asked. No catch, Hayes replied. They specifically requested you by name. Apparently, your reputation has reached some very high levels in the Pentagon. They want the pilot who redefined adversary training to help them figure out how to employ their newest toy. Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and saw it was from Morrison, now a squadron commander at Miramar. "Phoenix, turn on the news. Channel 7. Curious, Sarah pulled up the news channel on her tablet. The anchor was discussing a breaking story about a commercial airliner that had suffered a catastrophic engine failure over the Pacific, forcing an emergency landing at a remote airfield in Alaska. The details were still sketchy, but early reports suggested that the successful emergency landing had saved all 312 people aboard. What caught Sarah's attention wasn't the story itself, but the name of the pilot who'd executed the emergency landing. Captain Lisa "Ghost" Chun, her younger sister, who'd followed in Sarah's footsteps and become a commercial airline pilot after leaving the Air Force. Sarah's phone rang. Immediately. It was Lisa, calling from Anchorage. "Sarah, did you see the news?" Lisa's voice was shaky but excited. "I'm watching it now." "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, but Sarah, when the engine exploded, when we were losing hydraulics and electrical systems, I kept thinking about what you taught me. About staying calm, about using every option available, about never giving up even when the situation looks impossible." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Lisa, you saved 312 people. You did that, your training, your skill, your decision-making." "But I learned how to think like that from watching you," Lisa insisted. "From hearing the stories about Flight 47, about what you did when everything went wrong. You've been my inspiration since I was in flight school." After ending the call, Sarah walked out to the flight line where her F-16 sat ready for the afternoon training mission. The aircraft had become as familiar to her as the FA-18s she'd flown during her Navy career, but now it represented something different, not just a weapon of war, but a tool for making other pilots better, safer, more capable. Chief Rodriguez was performing a post-maintenance inspection on the aircraft. His experienced hands checking systems with the same careful attention he'd shown for the past 30 years. "Heard about your sister on the news," Rodriguez said, without looking up from his work. "Hell of a thing, bringing down a crippled airliner like that." "Runs in the family, I guess. She did good," Sarah agreed. "Really good." Rodriguez straightened up and fixed Sarah with a serious look. "You know, Phoenix, when you first showed up here 2 years ago, I wasn't sure you'd make it. You had the skills, but you were carrying a lot of weight from your past. I wondered if you'd be able to let go of what happened and focus on what you could become. And now? Now you're one of the finest pilots I've ever worked with. Not just because of your flying, though, that's exceptional, but because of what you've become as a leader, as a teacher. You've taken everything that happened to you, all that pain and disappointment, and turned it into something that makes other people better." Sarah looked across the flight line at the other aircraft in her squadron, each one representing a pilot whose skills had been honed by the challenges she'd presented in the air. Over the past 2 years, she'd flown against hundreds of military pilots, pushing them to their limits and forcing them to develop new capabilities they didn't know they possessed. "Chief," she said quietly, "when I was cleaning hangar floors at Miramar, I thought my story was over. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. And now?" Sarah smiled, the same confident expression that had once graced the face of Lieutenant Sarah Phoenix Chun during her Navy days. "Now I know the story is just beginning. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out who you really are." That evening, Sarah found herself back where it all started, in a hangar, surrounded by fighter aircraft. But this time she wasn't holding a mop. She was wearing a flight suit with her name and call sign embroidered on the chest. And she was home. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from an unknown number. "Miss Chun, this is Admiral Rebecca Martinez, Chief of Naval Operations. I wonder if you might be interested in discussing a consulting position with the Navy's newest tactical development program." Your country could use pilots like you. Admiral Martinez, Captain Steele Martinez, who'd authorized Sarah's unauthorized flight in the T-45 2 years ago, and had since been promoted to the highest levels of naval leadership. Sarah typed back a simple response: Admiral, it would be my honor to serve again. As she walked toward her car, Sarah passed the maintenance bay where a new group of pilots was preparing for their first red flag deployment. They looked young, eager, and slightly terrified, exactly the way she'd felt when she'd first climbed into that T-45 with Morrison. One of them, a fresh-faced lieutenant who couldn't have been more than 25, approached her nervously. "Ma'am, are you Phoenix?" he asked. "I am. Ma'am, I've read about what you did during Flight 47, and what you've accomplished here with Tactical Air Solutions. I was wondering, do you have any advice for someone just starting out?" Sarah looked at the young pilot and saw herself 8 years ago full of dreams and determination, unaware of the challenges that lay ahead, but ready to face them regardless. "Don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't fly," she said. "Not the medical boards, not the bureaucrats, not the people who think they know better than you what you're capable of. If you have the skill and the heart for it, find a way to stay in the air, even if it means cleaning hangar floors for a while." The lieutenant grinned. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am." As Sarah drove away from the base, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the heights of naval aviation to the depths of civilian invisibility, and back to a place where she could use her gifts to serve something larger than herself. Her Top Gun patch, now framed and hanging in her office, served as a reminder not of what she'd lost, but of what she'd found: the understanding that being a pilot wasn't just about flying aircraft, but about inspiring others to reach beyond what they thought possible. Phoenix had risen from the ashes, and she was soaring higher than ever before. 3 years later, when the first FAAX rolled off the production line with Tactics Manual co-authored by Sarah Phoenix Chun, and when her sister Lisa received the Airmanship Award for her heroic emergency landing, and when dozens of pilots she'd trained went on to distinguish themselves in combat and competition, people would remember the story of the woman who cleaned hangars until someone noticed her Top Gun patch. But Sarah would remember it differently. She'd remember it as the story of discovering that sometimes losing everything is the first step toward finding out what you're truly capable of becoming. The sky, as it turned out, had been waiting for her all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.